Welcome, fellow digital humanities scholars. My name is Gordon Kuhnfield. I'm an associate professor of communication at Villanova University. And I think I want to start by telling you a really old story.
According to an ancient Buddhist parable, a king commanded all of his subjects who had been blind from birth to be gathered together and shown to a different part of an elephant. This one the trunk, that one the foot, another the ears, another the tail. And afterwards, the king asked them to explain their perceptions of the elephant based on what they had felt. Unsurprisingly, and to the apparent delight of the king, they not only came to very different and contradictory conclusions about the nature of the elephant they felt, they came to blows. Now, to our modern ears, the parable sounds pretty ableist. Those born without sight are capable of using their other senses in complex and truly extraordinary ways to know the world around them, and elephants make a lot of noise. Ableism aside, this parable, like any parable, seeks to teach a spiritual truth. And the one that this communicates is not that monarchs were capricious, I'm sure they were, nor is it that our perceptions of the world are limited. Of course they are. It's rather that those who take sides and quarrels about the truth have become attached to the objects of perception. As a result, tusks become spears, trunks become trees, and tails become snakes. The blind subjects in this story are unable to be fully present in experience, to encounter oneself and things as connected aspects of a greater whole.
Now, like most parables, this one has survived a long time, which is usually a good indication that enough generations of people have found its wisdom of sufficient value to make it worth repeating. Despite its limitations, I want to use it as a metaphor for thinking about modality in the ethnographically informed study of urban culture. My argument is that thinking in terms of media and technologies of representation has a tendency to lead to a number of problematic assumptions, and I'm going to suggest instead that modality, and multimodality in particular, offers a more productive framework for thinking about the relationship between cultures and the digital technologies that we have available to tell stories about them. And I want to link these concerns to my own digital humanities project, Kensington Remembers.
I was on my way to catch the L. That's the noisy silver dragon that screeches along the elevated tracks that cut through Kensington as they follow the Delaware River north. I turned north on Emerald Street, and just as I crossed the street in front of a corner store, I spot this small shrine hiding in the weeds. The shrine had been cobbled together out of scraps of lumber and what looked like a repurposed piece of furniture. Empty liquor bottles had been carefully placed inside the cabinet, and around the lip of the platform on which it rested, a menagerie of stuffed animals covered the top and tumbled down the sides. Their fur was matted by the rain and bleached by the sun. R.I.P. Bug had been scrawled in black Sharpie across the chest of a once bright blue koala. Almost invisible in the weeds, a small rectangular concrete pad had been poured in the dirt. Inside was a plastered heart, bejeweled by what looked like marbles and the remains of candles. There was a baby's footprint, the words, "In memory of Bo," a photograph of a young man in a Phillies jersey. I went my way, but I returned frequently on my walks through the neighborhood. I couldn't find any information on who Bo was, how he died, or who performed this work of memory here. Still, I was drawn back by wonder about this intensely personal, affective work that his friends and family enacted here on a public sidewalk. I started finding other similar public expressions of private emotions, and they took a surprising variety of forms. A mural on the side of a corner row house to Mickey, graffiti dedicated to the memory of a Philadelphia legend, Disco Duck, one of the original practitioners of modern graffiti writing. A park bench in front of another row home dedicated to Louise, a ghost bike to Antonio Sandoval, a worker who was killed in a hit-and-run accident. I had been writing about collective memory since the early 2000s, but the scholarship I was familiar with focused almost exclusively on what I call the three M's: museums, monuments, mass media. What little scholarly focus did exist on such memorials, as I was finding, tended to subsume them into a narrative dominated by those official, elite, monumental forms of public memory and the theories that inevitably lean in their direction. I was finding this cultural phenomenon, and it didn't figure into the work of the many famed cultural and arts institutions in Philadelphia, like Mural Arts Philadelphia and Monument Lab. It didn't fit into the media's representation of this neighborhood as ground zero for the gun epidemic, the drug epidemic, and the homeless epidemic in the United States. And it didn't fit into predominant ways of thinking about public memory. So rather than approach from the safety of abstraction, I started walking.
So, inspired by the work of people like Walter Benjamin, who wrote extensively about a number of cities, and Eve Winken, who also has written extensively about urban walking from an ethnographic perspective, I started walking the streets of Kensington. I would photograph sites of memory as I would find them, take extensive field notes, collect geolocation information, try to map out the set of relations that make these sites possible, all in an effort to put the elephant together. I want to pivot now to talking a little bit about the relationship between ethnography and media and modality, and especially to talk about it from a communication perspective. And to begin, I want to start with two deceptively simple definitions of what ethnography involves.
First, etymologically, ethnography brings together two Greek words. The first, people or nation, that's the ethno part, and writing, that's the graphy part. Literally, culture writing. And in this sense, ethnography has been used since the early 19th century to describe the in-depth study of the whole way of life of a group or people. In these early uses, however, ethnography often involved writing from the safety and comfort of one's own home, speculating about ancient people or prehistoric people or distant, savage, and primitive groups found in the far-flung corners of the empire. And in this sense, ethnography was both racist and colonial. It served the purposes of empire, and it helped to establish white supremacy as a scientific principle. And this all started to change at the turn of the 20th century. By a strange twist of fate, a young anthropologist named Branislaw Malinowski found himself stranded in New Guinea at the outbreak of the Great War. Unable to return to London where he lived and worked, he spent several years living among the people of the Trobriand Islands, and his book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, transformed the method of ethnography. He learned their language and customs. He participated in their rites. He ate what they ate, drank what they drank, did what they did. He learned their culture, in other words, their whole way of life, still as an outsider, but from within. And he shared that story with care and empathy.
Malinowski would go on to champion this new kind of ethnography that has come to be called participant observation. And both to explain what I mean by that and to pivot to my next deceptively simple definition of ethnography, I want to share a quote from his book. He said, "It is good for the ethnographer to put aside camera, notebook, and pencil and join in himself in what is going on."
And this leads me to my second deceptively simple definition of ethnography as hanging out. Unlike the early work written from the safety and comfort of one's armchair, Malinowski's innovation emphasized the importance of participant observation. In Clifford Geertz's words, of being there, wherever there may be, participating in the ordinary and extraordinary lives of others. James Clifford terms this practice of sympathetic participant observation deep hanging out. And again, it's Clifford Geertz who explains what that means. He writes that ethnographic fieldwork is localized, long-term, close-in vernacular research. And what makes this hanging out deep is what he would elsewhere famously term thick description.
What I'm trying to get at with these admittedly simple definitions of ethnography is really just 2 points. First, that the body and the senses and the sensuality and the history and experience of the observer are deeply implicated in both the participation and observation that comes with observing another culture. The second point is that the media through which we encode those experiences are also deeply implicated. In other words, how we are in the world shapes the way in which we know the world, and so too do the media through which we engage the world of observation. And this is a point that Walter Benjamin makes very well in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility.
By way of setting up his controversial argument about aura, Benjamin posits that just as the entire mode of existence of human collectives changes over long historical periods, so too does their mode of perception. The way in which human perception is organized, the medium in which it occurs, is conditioned, he says, not only by nature, but by history.
What Benjamin is doing here is brilliant. He's giving consciousness and perception, which we typically take to be universal, ahistorical absolutes, a history. And he argued that historical changes in the organization of consciousness and perception are linked to changes in medium, in modality. And I think it's important that Benjamin chose this term, technological reproducibility, rather than technology, because if we focus on media as technology, we inevitably end up in this kind of McLuhan-esque argument about technological determinism. This tends to promote Western modernity as an ahistorical universal absolute, much like the early iterations of ethnography. This tends to promote colonial thinking and white supremacy, and these, of course, are problems. So I think instead I want to try to understand the way in which intersubjective knowledge of the sort that we gain from ethnographic observation, the kind that depends on our senses and our consciousness and our presence, is that something we just find out in the world. It's produced, it's created, and it's not simply a matter of transparently, accurately representing the culture of others. It's about the use of modality and one's own senses and experience and sensuality to constitute the other for still other others, in other words, the audience.
This brings me to the concept of modality, which I get from Gunther Kress and Theo van Leeuwen's book, Reading Images. Now, their argument is that our understandings of reality and our ability to communicate about those understandings are bound up with the technologies of representation and reproduction. In other words, what counts as real, what seems realistic, is conventionally tied to technologies of representation. In their view, we don't so much represent the world. Instead, we represent our intersubjective understanding of the world in a way that others perceive as accurate. And ethnographers have taken up this concept of modality in interesting ways. Kimberly Powell, for example, writes about the importance of map making as a multisensory process. It draws on multiple modes of engagement and representation in an effort to create a sense of place. Sarah Pink writes about multimodality and multisensoriality in the production of ethnographic knowledge. And like the parable of the blind and the elephant, she makes the point that our senses are all phenomenologically interconnected. They're not discrete and discontinuous. They're part of a whole person. Similarly, in order to represent a whole way of life, she argues, we need to draw on multiple modalities and multisensorality research. I want to make one final connection here to an invitation to multimodality published by the editors of the journal American Anthropologists. They justify the turn to multimodality with 3 points. First, it acknowledges the centrality of media production to everyday life, not only for researchers, but also for the people and places where fieldwork happens. Second, Multimodality extends to the research process as well as to the afterlife of anthropologically intended media. In other words, modalities are constitutive of ethnographic inquiry itself, as well as being ways of representing the results of that inquiry to broader audiences. Third, they argue that multimodality characterizes the way people work and conduct research in the contemporary world, beyond the finished products of fieldwork, which traditionally has been writing, literacy, the monograph.
So I want to conclude on a kind of speculative note, and it's the idea that the fates of multimodality and digital humanities scholarship are connected. Modes of representation are constitutive of knowledge about the world, and I think both digital scholarship and ethnography will benefit from thinking through the implications of this. The preoccupation with literacy and print media in traditional ethnographic work has begun to give way to the idea that there are more sophisticated digital tools for telling more sophisticated stories, more multi-sensory stories about the cultures of other people. And similarly, digital humanistic inquiry has been expanding our thinking beyond the book to thinking about the affordances of digital media in a way that really opens up new answers to questions about what we can study and how we can go about studying it and how we go about communicating this constituted knowledge to audiences. And I want to hear what you think about these arguments and these ideas. I look forward to an exchange with you. Finally, I want to thank DHSI for making this possible. I want to thank Erica Hayes at Falvey Library at Villanova University for all her support and work. I want to thank the Vice Provost for supporting my digital scholarship with money. And finally, I want to thank you for your kind attention. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about this. Thank you.